Good evening. I'm Jennifer Lazeski. I'm the executive director of the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, and we are here tonight to talk about Greater Prairie-chickens and some of the conservation efforts that are ongoing right now. You can, as I mentioned, feel free to ask questions along the way. My co-pilot here is my co-chair on the WSO Conservation Committee, Rebecca Gilman. You can also put questions into the chat and we can work with things as we go along. Part of why we're talking about prairie chickens is that people are so passionate about these birds being in Wisconsin. They are a very unique and charismatic bird. Those are some of the typical phrases that we use to describe them. That really starts with the lekking and male displays that happen in the spring. There are certain birds, particularly some of the grouse and prairie grouses, that do this gathering where the males compete to show how worthy they are for the females. And for the greater prairie chickens, they have this extended sack. They make big booming sounds. They do a little pounding dance. So they're very, very interesting during these displays. And so it's something that's very notable. I know I was a little skeptical when I started working on this issue. Well, they are found in other places. Why should we worry about them in Wisconsin? But they have been in Wisconsin for a very long time. They're a spark bird for a lot of people that get them interested in birds. They bring attention and tourism to the local area. There are a lot of reasons why they are worth keeping in this state. I'm not going to try to play a video here, but if you are interested in videos, this is one of the better ones that really has a good show. But showing Wisconsin's prairie chickens goes all the way back to a Disney film back when they had the TV series and films that had a lot of wildlife documentaries. Part of one of those documentaries was filming Wisconsin's prairie chickens. So there are also a lot of people engaged in these efforts, and it takes some effort to do it. So it's a thing that people remember. They bring kids and grandkids to, as they get older. And for over 70 years, we've had many, many people coming to help as scientists and community scientists in this effort to log how many birds there are in the display, to pay attention to. There's some great accounts from Fran Hammerstrom of how they, individually kept track and tried to get all their viewers to keep track of the particular markings on some of the prairie chickens during this time. So there's really a lot of opportunities to see them, and it helps make people passionate about them and about other issues in bird conservation. Just a little bit of background on, kind of what's happened with them over time in the state. So they were originally tall grass prairie and oak savanna birds. So that meant they were mostly in that, southwestern, southern part of the state. Then when in the mid 19th century, when you started to have all that timber cutting, that was one of the industries, but also clearing for farmlands, all of a sudden you had all of this empty land all over, and they spread out accordingly. They were a very numerous bird until hunting, kind of took them out. But then once that land started to change again, you had the regrowth of forests up in the northern part of the state and all kinds of other land uses coming into play over time. So that kind of pushed them back into smaller and smaller areas. So right now we're looking at mostly the central part of Wisconsin is where they're remaining. But even within that area, there have been changes in land use, human development and structures, different types of agriculture and expanding agriculture, larger agriculture as opposed to family farms. And then there's kind of a continuous battle. Most of Wisconsin is not originally prairie, and especially for us in the eastern part of the state, people think they can put a prairie in their yard everywhere, but a lot of the state is originally woodland. And that's what it's going to revert to if you don't keep battling it. And especially with invasives as well now, buckthorn and a lot of other things. You really have to keep clearing the land in order to keep that forest and brush from advancing. So that doesn't happen all the time. And then you have these growths that are not conducive, then are not grasslands or even oak savannas anymore. Savannas are kind of characterized as 50% or less trees. There are areas where there's prairie with kind of intermittent trees and a little bit of shade. In one of the biggest things in conservation and thinking about ecology, now is thinking in landscape terms. People didn't necessarily anticipate that we were again going to end up with all these isolated habitats. But now that we have, and you can see some of that kind of in the crosshatch areas on the right, those are the different wildlife reserves and areas that are in central Wisconsin. To connect those, it's going to take effort. So you want to think in larger terms about what's needed to connect those habitats to create a habitat that animals can move through and create that genetic diversity. As soon as you have those isolated populations in particular habitat areas, you're losing some of that genetic diversity, and that's what helps a species survive. So one of the biggest efforts for prairie chickens and other grassland birds, because grassland birds are a huge concern overall, not just prairie chickens, is to create larger grassland areas and create that movement and larger habitats that many of the birds and animals need. So in 2004, the DNR land planning created the Central Wisconsin Grassland Conservation Area. So that includes some of those other areas. So you're talking about Leola, Paul Olson, Mead, and Buena Vista, and trying to connect those areas in between and working with both public and private lands. There are a number of organizations that try to enroll farmers in agricultural conservation programs and other efforts to keep some land not farmed, not developed, and in grassland habitat. And the hope is that then we can provide those stepping stones in between those larger conservation areas. So this plan has been in place. It's been part of the Central Sands Master Plan, I think, or Hills, sorry, Master Plan, and also incorporates the prairie chicken, the Greater Prairie-chicken management plans. So there's both land plans and species plans. And in this case, we've got 3 different ones that are working together in this area to try to protect prairie chickens, but also other grassland birds and animals. I just wanted to mention some of the prairie chicken history because I find it fascinating. That was one of the things I started digging into a little bit, knowing WSO has property in this area. And that the Hammerstroms have a very strong connection to WSO. They were part of the founding members in 1939, as well as being members of the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. And Fran Hammerstrom was a relatively prolific writer about her experiences. She was an East Coast socialite who came out with her husband and became part of the basically the wildlife management study program at the University of Wisconsin, working under Aldo Leopold. So they made some forays outside of the state at different points, but they always stayed very connected to this research area in the Buena Vista Marsh. They made that area their home and they worked there for the predecessor to the DNR. And she writes some very vivid stories about what that was like, what the community was like, how they brought in students and visitors to work on these projects. So if you're at all interested, I really encourage you to read some of those accounts. There's one that's kind of specific to prairie chickens, but then a lot of those same stories are repeated in her longer kind of autobiography book also. And there's a biography that's more of kind of a young person's or a children's book about them that has some interesting information too. Um, they were what part of the impetus for the private land purchases that happened, as well as the public land purchases that started in the 50s. Um, this was a real controversial thing. It's hard for us to imagine now in some ways, but in other ways, well, there's plenty of ways that there's controversies about conservation. But there was some hesitation to start the public land buying because farmers were increasingly resistant. They didn't want land being bought up just to be preserved. They wanted land being used. That's probably not so. That there's a lot of currency to that too right now. But so in order to keep the projects rolling, they kind of identified some specific properties. The management plan that the Hammerstroms came up with was understanding in this area they couldn't buy a whole contiguous area of property. So there was what kind of a patchwork. They thought if you could protect the spots that were needed for nesting and brooding, that the rest would fall into place. So they encouraged groups, and groups did fundraising and bought properties in the area. So before the public purchasing really got big, there was a lot of private activity. So this is an interesting combination of a lot of different groups. WSO bought a small amount, but they did a lot of interesting fundraising to get money for that. Then you have the Prairie Chicken Foundation and Dane County Conservation League, which was a big land purchaser. And I'll never get it right, but basically the Society for the Latin name of the prairie chicken, which also bought a significant amount of land, but then sold it to the DNR. So all of these various groups from different areas and parts of the state were all working to preserve prairie chickens. I love this photo because it shows what it really means when you're talking about habitat for prairie chickens. They really want those wide open spaces that they can see and they know what's going on. Um, and that's kind of really the outer, the overview of what they want and need. That also makes them a great umbrella species for other grassland birds and animals. Because if this is what they need and they're, the most endangered animal, it helps gain that type of habitat for other animals. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So before I move into what prairie chickens need, does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. So, but again, feel free to ask if you have questions. So, one of the things that's more unusual, and there are other grouse that are like this also, is that they need different types of habitat at different points in the year and for different parts of their annual cycle. So we're going to take a little look at each of these. Um, where we really start is with Lex or booming grounds. They become the center of an area and a group of prairie chickens. We'll see how that plays out as we're talking about the solar farm at the end. But basically, these are areas that have very short grass, hard ground, because they're usually starting early in the spring. They want to be visible. They want everybody to hear them as they boom and stomp. They want to draw in, all the hens. They don't want to get hit by predators. So, they want to make sure they can see what's going on. And that is where, the females select the males, the mating actually happens. And then the males tend to hang around in that area. The females will go off a little ways, usually somewhere within a mile or two to nest. So they need a little bit different habitat for that. And I'm sorry you're going to see a bunch of black and white photos because actually haven't seen a lot that's been done more recently that shows a lot of this same habitat. But that 1957 Guide to Prairie Chicken Management is another really interesting start to understanding prairie chickens. You see a lot of the same information in the current management guides, and sometimes it's more condensed. But I found it really interesting to go through the original studies because game management was a very new thing when this was written by the Hammerstroms and another co-author. So they really tried to get all the information across. In that nesting habitat, so you had the very, very short grass, kind of pounded out areas where the leks are. But the hens need a little bit of protection. So they're more in medium grass with a medium density. They want to be able to escape if a predator comes. So they want to be able to shoot straight up. They're not under a shrub or covered by something. And at the time, in the 50s and even into the 60s, bluegrass seed farming was one of the predominant uses in the area, which worked out to be pretty ideal for what they needed as long as they could convince the farmers to mow at certain times, after the nests were done. And, there wouldn't be mortality. Um, since then, though, you've seen a lot of development of regular corn and soybean agriculture. There's a lot of potato farms in the area. Cranberry farms are getting to be big. So you're losing a lot of what used to be that ideal habitat, which was part of why that patchwork system could work. The Hammerstroms understood that they couldn't get all the land purchased. So it was, how do you where's the most important places to buy that land? And their assumption was that farming would continue to be the way it was with that bluegrass seed and, a number of other things that were more compatible with for what prairie chickens needed. That hasn't happened. So that's, something we'll talk about as those areas have constricted. That's been part of the issue too. Once those chicks hatch, things change a little bit. They start walking pretty quickly. They're precocial, meaning they can just get out there, fend for themselves a little bit, but they stick with their mother for quite a long time. So they need to be able to walk around in that area. There can't be too many obstacles, too much tall grass, things like that. They need basically tons and tons of insects. As most birds, your best protein source for those growing chicks is insects. So both in the area that's there, you hope there's little to no pesticide use, that there are also some forbs or flowers. There tend to be more insects around, and some of those rather than just grasses. So they really need a little bit more of that mix, but not too many flowers, or if they can get too tall and there's too much cover and too much worry about predators. So again, it's a lot of princess and pea things. They need it just right. And each type of habitat needs to be a little bit different. So it gets a little complicated. And finally, they're in their overwintering. They're working with what's left over in the fields. They use that as food sources. As you see in some of the older pictures, there was a lot more standing corn. I think these days, once the machine goes through, you don't have that as much either for food or shelter. The Hammerstroms used to stock corn cribs and do all kinds of things to try to get food to them in the winter. But they weren't very practical for humans before the era of the snowmobile and other things that could haul all of that out there. So it was a bit of a project to try to do a lot of that and keep the population going. But what they eat naturally and what they need for shelter is not just flat grassland. So they do need to have some areas where there's some shrubs and trees and things that help them shelter as well as sheltering in the snow. So just to kind of recap, we talked about this idea of umbrella species. As I've been reading things in the PSC proceeding, it's something the other side really doesn't understand. You know, they think, oh, if you create general grassland, that's enough. That's fine for the prairie chickens. And as we just saw, it's not, because they have these very particular needs at different times of the year and for different parts of, of between, males, females, and chicks, what's needed to keep the species going. So they're more particular, but in being more particular, they also still provide for all these other species that have some of these same needs, these big grasslands to start with, and then, some of these other things. So this is also something that we looked at and factor in that PSC proceeding on the solar farm issues. So you need at least 2 miles of open grassland. You've got that lek in the center. And then you want a mile on either side, sometimes a little bit more for that nesting habitat. And then, you want that high insect density, which the way common agriculture is now doesn't necessarily work very well. They're trying to get rid of the bugs and the weeds and everything else that helps with that. But then they also have to have those places to shelter and get winter food. One of the ways that we figure out how the population is doing is to do these annual LEC surveys. So this is something where the DNR works with volunteers and the University of Stevens Point is involved, and everybody's out there looking and counting at as you can see on the chart, 4 major areas where there are typically LECs in central Wisconsin. So there's, protocols to things. There's a process so that you're comparing year to year, and they're used to make those management decisions. Where are they doing well? Where are they having trouble? Where did we lose a LEC? Where's a new LEC? And trying to do those counts and identify who's there. So that's the one thing that happens annually. It's a little harder to count the hens when they're kind of dispersed all over the place. So this is typically what's used, to gather that information and compare it year to year. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Um, Moving on to Buena Vista Wildlife Area specifically, as you could see, that was the red line at the top of the chart. So this is currently the area where we have the most prairie chickens, and continuously. So as I mentioned, it's a scattered area. Even once the public lands were purchased, it's not one continuous area like you see in many of the other wildlife refuges, wildlife areas, state parks. So it still has a little bit of that cobbled together impact, and still seems to work. This is the prairie chicken holdout. And it is the place where you see the most, but it also is a refuge for other grassland birds. So it's been named an important bird area. That's a designated title that they've gone through the whole state to figure out what are some of the most important areas for all life stages and for migrating birds. So they're places that you won't necessarily always see the most birds, or they're not the most accessible, but they are incredibly important for the species in Wisconsin. In this case, yes, the greater prairie chicken, but we've mentioning a few others here that are also present and either state threatened or less common. So now we'll move on to the solar farm. This was their original proposal. So they were talking about a project size of nearly 10,000 acres. That's nearly as big as the entire Buena Vista Wildlife Area. If it goes through at this size, it would be one of, they're saying number 2 or number 3 in size in the country. So I'm saying at least top 5. There might be other things in the pipeline now. So within that acreage, they're talking about nearly 7,000 acres for their primary array, which is kind of in that pink color here. So they do this by leased land. So they have various farmers and other property owners who will let them build on their land. We're hearing typically a 30-year lease, and they get paid for, every year on that lease. So it's really more of a threat than I think people even conceived of, just because of the kind of dollars that they're offering farmers, especially in a point where agriculture can be dicey. Or it's not as profitable as it was at one point, or you have succession issues. Kids don't want to stay and run the farm. So this is offering ways out and ways that have a lot of money to them. So I think a lot of this area came primarily from one person, I believe, from what we've kind of been seeing and hearing, but it is over a little bit different areas. This falls within kind of the north and northwest part of the Buena Vista Wildlife Area vicinity. WSO's property is below W, so it's not right within this range, although it is still in the area. The orange is what's called alternate arrays. Apparently, under the rules, they have to have 25% of the primary arrays as places where they can go if a primary array area doesn't work for one reason or another. Environmental concerns, it's just not the perfect place. There's a lot of flexibility that's allowed in this construction. This is not an absolute firm plan. So, there's always kind of maneuvering and wiggle room. This is also a project that's going to include a large battery storage system. So that is kind of a secondary issue within its application for all this. Not every solar facility has that. So just to kind of make sure I'm not skipping over some of the basics with this, if you're trying to get more information on this and you're thinking about doing comments on it, the applicant is Vista Sands Solar. They're part of a larger energy company, Doral. And that's above board. Everybody knows about it. They are also not a public energy company. So there's different rules that kind of go with that. They're just coming in to develop this. They can either run it themselves or they can sell it to somebody else. So it's a little bit different system than what we might think of when your local power company, does their construction. PSC and the DNR staff work together on this. Prairie chickens are not the only environmental concern. So there's a lot going on in all different kinds of environmental things: wells, digging, streams, where they put the wires, which are now going underground. All the transmission wires are going underground because everybody was concerned about them being in the air with prairie chickens and other issues. So there's just lots of different things going on with that. The final environmental impact statement has a lot of different aspects to it. So, the Greater Prairie-chickens concerns that we all have are just a small part of what's going on in the big picture with, an energy or solar farm construction. So you have the applicant, and then you have the PSC and the DNR doing evaluations as staff. You can either intervene in favor of this development, or the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation has filed an intervener against this. Prairie chickens are also not the only concern of what's going on. They do have other wildlife and environmental concerns. So Tom Huggy, who I mentioned in the beginning, has been working also on deer and hunting and all these fences, and other things, other concerns with the way this is being built and where it's being built. So this is a joint effort. Thankfully, the WWF has taken the lead on this, and George Meyer, the former director at the DNR, is leading these efforts. But WSO, Green Fire, and the Dane County Conservation League all are participating and, working to represent these interests. Decision will come down at the very end, most likely, which will be probably late December or early January. So even though the hearings and things are ending, there'll be a long period that the PSC has to make the decision. For comments and for your information, I'm going to talk through some of kind of the general things that have been coming through in testimony and the environmental impact statement and what WSO has said and other groups have said. So please feel free to raise your hand, shoot a comment into the chat, or unmic yourself and ask about a question, if you want to discuss one of these areas as we kind of talk about them. I think the biggest one, and the one that nobody wants to get lost in this process, is that state threatened species should be protected whenever possible. That somebody shouldn't just be able to come in and build wherever they want right next to or where they already are. So especially when there's plenty of other places to build. This is a difficult one for a lot of conservation organizations because they do support renewable energy. And there are interveners on behalf supporting renewable energy. But it's just, we feel very strongly that, yes, that's great. And we do need that, but not here. When there are other places you can build, we can say not here. There's just been huge amounts of time and energy invested in this area and in trying to keep the greater prairie chicken species in Wisconsin. So here's a couple of things that came through in testimony from one of the experts, also over the historical value of, what has been purchased. And so this is not little bits of money. This is large amounts of public and private conservation interests, as well as all the time and effort and energy and planning that has gone into this. I mean, there are also already plans in place that have gone through a public process that have been approved, that the priority is greater prairie chickens and creating this grassland. There's only so many places in Wisconsin where we can build this kind of grassland and still have this amount of land available to do that with. Big thing with prairie chickens, they are birds of avoidance. They don't like being around a lot of structures. They like that wide open land. Solar farms are a very new development, so there's not specific science on it. Then you get into which way each side responds to that. The applicant says, well, there's no science that says you can't or that it's going to harm them, so of course we can. And on the other side, the DNR and that EIS that includes the PSC and WWF are saying no. That means there's a state threatened species. You don't want to jeopardize them. Don't do anything that might do them harm. They're the priority in this situation. Since there's not a specific science on it, then you get into each side using different comparable situations on comparable birds. So that has been Lowell's great, wonderful existence of digging through the science and arguing about how comparable different grouse species are, different structures, different, energy kind of compounds, or the way that they're constructed, wind turbines versus solar arrays, and all kinds of fun things like that. So there's been a lot of testimony and expert arguments about that, citing the literature. So this is something that is new. So there hasn't been a lot already written or discussed about this. So it's unfortunate for Wisconsin that we have to do all this work and that we're on the forefront, but we are, so we do it. What it has come down to so far, between the draft environmental impact statement, the comments that everybody made, the research that both the DNR did and some of our experts did, is that they want to limit basically areas where things shouldn't be built, so that there's some kind of a setback zone or a buffer zone at a minimum between, where the solar arrays and the construction is and where the prairie chickens are. So we'll go through kind of where things are at the moment after rebuttal testimony. So the final environmental impact statement talked about taking certain numbered solar arrays out of contention, that they were just too close to where the prairie chicken habitat is. So what you see here is kind of all of that put together. The red and orange is the proposed solar arrays on construction areas. The green is Buena Vista Wildlife Area and other conservation lands. And then you're talking about the kind of the green bubble around is that half mile around the whole Buena Vista Wildlife Area. The yellow with the little prairie chickens dancing around in the middle is the mile around known lek areas. So most of that kind of fits within the same structure as that half mile around the Buena Vista Wildlife Area. So everything seems to be pretty much lining up, as that's the minimum, and that's the primary recommendation from the DNR, is taking out those crosshatched areas from the solar array proposal. Of course, the other side says, oh, that takes out 20 to 30% of our capacity, and that's just too much. We won't be able to build. So that's really where the battle is, if that's just a bluff. And, when you're talking about one of the largest solar arrays in the nation, is that true? Is it not true? But that recommendation has been made in the final EIS. Then there's kind of a backup that's a little bit less than that. That's going to be the PSC's decision to make. And kind of some secondary things about habitat as other points or things that you may consider important too. VSS has argued that, they'll put grass under the solar arrays. That's the same thing. That's grassland. That should satisfy the prairie chickens. Well, number one, as we talked about, there's this wide array of things they need, not just general grassland. That might be helpful for the grassland birds and some other things that need it, but they've already talked about the particular mix of grasses to make sure it's the right native grasses, and really does provide that. They also can't be spraying pesticides on it. They can't be mowing at the wrong times. So, there are some restrictions to what that really means, and how to handle it. But on the other hand, again, because we don't have any studies, we don't know if the prairie chickens will ever use that area. Are they going to look at it like it's shrubs, which is a lot of the argument that's being made by the pro environment people. So it's, kind of an unknown. And then you throw in, which, I think isn't necessarily obvious from what you're seeing about the plans here, is that those arrays will have, and buildings and everything else will have 7-foot fences around the entire section. So we're talking about completely changing the landscape and mobility and movement of all wildlife in that area, but you're creating obstructions for prairie chickens and other animals. You are providing predator perches, whether they're inside or outside of the solar array area. So one of the other things that's been argued about is providing gaps in the fence underneath so that smaller wildlife can move through. There's a lot of issues that don't really have a resolution here. There's also going to be, combined with this, and I didn't talk about the smaller solar project that's already north of Buena Vista Wildlife Area, but that's starting soon. This would be another 3 to 5 years of construction. So you're talking about potentially 5 to 7 years of construction with all those vehicles and, soil moving around and things going on and disturbances, that may provide another thing that drives prairie chickens away or makes them condense even more. And the final point is VSS is saying, well, there might be some loss of habitat, mostly, just because they may, want to be away from something. So we'll give you something in return. We'll give you this 160 leased acres of, grassland that we'll seed as open grassland. But we'll only do that if we get to keep most of our arrays. We're not going to agree to, what the EAIS recommends. And, in return, the argument is, well, that's not a deal anybody wants. The primary recommendation is to get rid of a larger number of those arrays. And it's not going to replace the potential losses. Any questions about any of those points before I talk about how you can submit your comments?
Jennifer, there's a couple of
Yeah.
questions in the chat.
Okay.
One person's wondering how viable solar panels or solar farms are in Wisconsin, and if you know where the energy or the electricity from the solar farms will go.
Yeah. You can find out information about anything that has filed for approval on solar farms through the PSC website. So Lowell maybe has the number, but I think there were more than 20, maybe more than 30 throughout the state that were kind of already in the works. And they're spread out around all over, I wouldn't say all over, not in the middle of the forest, but there's not one particular area. But there's also quite a few that they're talking about in the same area as Buena Vista and some of the other counties that are right around there, because it's wide open farmland. That's the easiest thing for them, is they don't want to have to go cut down trees or put in effort. They want things that are already pretty much cleared out, because the arrays need sun and, they're relatively close to the ground. In terms of any one sites and where the power would go, it's a marketplace, as far as I understand. I'm not an expert in this, but there have been comments in the testimony that basically VSS, is likely to sell it to, certain power companies. They still need a hookup to the transmission line. So I think that they're relying on ATC to do that, and it's a separate construction permit and some other things going on. So none of this is a simple and done deal, even if this would go through. So there are lots of other things involved with that.
Great. And then one other question was
Tom, did you have a comment on that?
I'm sorry, Tom.
Just to add, Jennifer, one of the reasons why they are here in the first place, as well as the smaller Portage solar facility that you mentioned earlier, is that it is very close proximity to an existing transmission line that has excess capacity and can basically absorb the energy produced by this facility. So it's not just random that they
Right.
pick this spot. And I believe George Meyer told me that the total price tag for this thing, and I don't know if it's over the life of the project or not, but it's somewhere between 2.5 and 2.6 billion dollars. This is not a small investment, and so I'm pretty sure that they've done their homework with regards to whether or not this is a financially viable investment.
Right.
So the solar energy that they can harness in central Wisconsin it's a viable enterprise, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that transmission connection. I kind of hinted at it with the, ATC is expected to do that part. But yeah, they have definitely said that's why they are where they are. And then, there's also a bunch of projects that we're hearing are in the works for the area. They might not have filed necessarily yet, but they're certainly going around making offers to farmers. Okay, Rebecca, next question.
What is the specific concern about the battery storage facility?
That's again not my area of expertise. I know there's been a lot of back and forth on that, but they are huge lithium batteries. So it's, anything from fire preparedness, local efforts, if something happens, how do they switch out the batteries? Are the batteries not going to leak? Kind of all the things you could think of when you talk about batteries is what I've seen floating around. But there may be more significant concerns than that too. Anything else?
That's all we had in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. All right, then we're going to send you again more specific information in an email about comments and particular things you can say, although you can kind of grab onto, any of those things. What we have heard is that general comments aren't as helpful as things that are more specific, because this is final comments about the project and about the environmental impact statement, that you talk about specific things based on your experience, things you've read, things you understand, and talking about the science, what the advantages or disadvantages are of these things, and really explaining your connection to prairie chickens if you have one. Personal experiences are a very valid thing in this process, but to do something more than just, we need to save the prairie chickens. Well, explain a little bit about why. And those comments are more likely to, get through kind of, as something that's reported. They will put the comments together. So, to some extent, volume does matter a little bit. They kind of summarize what a lot of the comments are for the commissioners who are doing the evaluation. If you want to be heard directly, the best thing to do is to go to the public hearing. Even if you're reading in a statement, it's going into the record. But it's your choice about how you do this. There's no specific rules. We just hope that you'll put some effort into it and be thoughtful. And that will really register the concerns. So we don't know. This is kind of it's not a commonplace situation what we're in, and it's fairly unusual that there was an environmental impact statement as opposed to a more general environmental assessment. So there is recognition on the PSC's part, that this is a big deal. We want you to keep making it a big deal. So here's how to do it. Rebecca and I will be there at the public hearing, as will some other members from other organizations. So we hope that you will find a way to make yourself heard. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me or contact Rebecca. As I said, I will stay here as long as there are questions to be answered. So, we'll turn off the recording and we'll be happy to answer some more questions if you have them. Lowell and Tom, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we sign off the recording?
No, I don't. That was a very good presentation. Covered a lot of things that were really important. Thank you.
Okay. All right, then Rebecca, if you can turn off the recording.